Welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Join us as we dive deep into games you know or may never have heard of. I am your host, Max, and joining me is my co-host, Troy. Working behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about Numenera, the Ninth World. So this is a game we've actually played. We're trying to do more of that, in all fairness, before we do these reviews, but we've actually had a fair bit of experience getting into the cipher system, which is the mechanics behind this. But in fact, my first introduction was actually playing the game proper.
We had a decently long campaign with about 2 to 4 players at different points. And man, we got to do a lot of Ninth World stuff. We went up and down the map, encountered some of the core factions. We got away with some pretty big hijinks, but I think part of the setting is being able to pull off big wins when you have the right cipher, or the right tech. But it was a really cool experience, and it's really neat to see it expanded upon in the new, I don't want to call it edition, but the revised version, you might say.
Yeah, we can get into the origins of this now and kind of give people a broader view of where this game comes from. So this game is produced by Monte Cook Games, by primarily Monte Cook, who is one of the major writers of, I would call the mid-era of role-playing games. So was a writer for Planescape and Dark Space, and then moved on to being one of the main writers for the D&D 3rd edition supplements and 3.5. And also, I think, actually, if I think back to when he worked at TSR for a while, and he partly helped establish the dark matter setting for Alternity, which is something we can talk about another time. But up until making this game, I had mainly known his work for the Tullus setting, which is this huge, maybe it's 900-page tome that is one city in this weird sort of, it's a fantasy setting. It's definitely an FRP. It's the edition I got was for 3rd edition, 3.5. And yeah, that's a whole thing. I mean, maybe we'll cover that at some point, but that's the largest by size role-playing book I have ever bought. And I'm a little bit surprised that I bought it. Not that it was bad. It was too much to even process.
Right.
But then after all of that, he started Monte Cook Games with Shanna Germain in 2012. And they began a Kickstarter for Numenera the following year, I suppose. I guess they were in development for a while. And their Kickstarter was very successful, right out the gate. What were those numbers again?
It was a goal of 20,000, but they broke over 500. So 500,000 over that as their total amount. So they really smashed that goal. And I mean, they'd been in development from 2012 into 2013 when the Kickstarter started. So there had been some time where they were producing materials and artwork and content and the rules. So there was actually something for the Kickstarter to show off, as opposed to what sometimes happens where there isn't really a lot of content when the Kickstarter hits the ground and you're kind of wondering what you're throwing in for. But that was not the case with this. This had a clearly defined offer, and I think it was something that was different at the time, and people really were on board.
I don't want to say that there was a lot of rules light systems, but the RPG world was still kind of dabbling in the board game mechanic concept, though I think most of that had passed already. I usually think of that as being 2005 and then going a little bit forward to 2012. And this has some of that influence, but I think it does a better job of kind of keeping it a role-playing game. As much as it seems like it comes from nowhere, and we'll get into the setting, which is, I guess, broadly described as being Earth 1 billion years in the future.
Yes.
I guess it kind of comes down to that. I think it's an Arthur C. Clarke quote that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big element of this. The other things that I see in it that I guess are a thematic influence are Planescape. So obviously Monte Cook coming off of making Planescape in the past, and Planescape has this very larger than life worlds beyond worlds, and things representing things. It's not as heavy-handed as that, though I don't think that that's a disadvantage in Planescape, but there's a vibe of that in Numenera. In the case of Numenera, it's less about dimensional space and it's more about time.
Yes.
And the idea that prior to the characters beginning their adventure in their world, the world that they're in has been many, many worlds prior to this. So that's why they refer to them as the ninth world, which is the one you started. Those worlds aren't like dimensional worlds. They're more like chronological ages, but of such density and magnitude that like nobody even remembers how long any of them were. And it's more about what they left behind. And in some sense, it's a bit like, I don't want to call it a post-apocalyptic world because that, I think that simplifies it too much, but it has that idea of things before you that have been forgotten, and maybe there was some great civilization and then it either fell apart or it transcended reality and now you're left with the bits and pieces of it.
A very dying Earth, correct?
Yeah, but without the dying part.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I guess Jack Vance is kind of an influence on this, but I don't see it as much as another influence that I noticed, which would be Jean Giraud, better known as Mobius.
Okay.
And as a French sci-fi comic creator, there's a few other creatives in that field that are related to that person, but he's one of the co-founders of Metal Hurlant, which is the French version of Heavy Metal Magazine. There's a lot of this sort of eclectic, it's colorful, but it's also dark. It's got these interesting dynamics. It doesn't overtly claim any of that, but I just see that look, that sort of strange French sci-fi thing kind of woven through it.
So the printing of this is, there was originally a single core book called Numenera, the Ninth World, that was followed with the current revised edition and a supplement. So now you can purchase or read Numenera Discovery and then Numenera Destiny as the two companion books. Discovery being not just a reprint, a little more than that, with revised explanations, errata included, some rebalancing. But that would be representative of the core base game. And Destiny is what is new with this revised edition. You'll find these books have 2-column printing with annotated margins, really clean, crisp, easy to read, really well structured, and the artwork is consistent, really strong, and really helps you get in the headspace. Sometimes it's a little like, it's just like silly characters holding magic orbs, there's a lot of that, but it's overall very good.
The art successfully captures the vibe of the game in that it feels magical, but also in a more of a science fiction context. If you're going to go out and get this, it's probably worth just getting the revised edition because it is sort of like a 1.5.
Yeah.
And then that will have all the rebalancing and everything. And then it will pair directly into the expansion, which is Destiny. So we'll be covering essentially both books. And as there's not much of a difference between the first printing and the second printing of the first book, then yeah, it'll all be in one.
It's interesting to think of Destiny as an expansion because it almost fundamentally alters the experience so much that it's like, is it the same game without it?
It's true.
It's really cool that it introduces this idea that you are changing the world. Like in core Numenera, your characters are being changed by the world themselves. So like you're being exposed to nanites or different tech or alien biology that's actually changing who your character is. And then in Destiny, it's like you get your turn back to start crafting and making things and building things. And it's like your turn to influence the world and make your push against it. And it kind of feels like in the revised edition, that's the point of there being a revised edition, was to incorporate Destiny. So, I mean, it changes the game. It really does. And we were talking before where it incorporates things you might be more familiar with from, say, more modern video games that incorporate base building, crafting, finding and making weapons, right? A lot of these ideas now have become core to the Destiny experience, which is, again, different than what you may have done if you were playing the original Ninth World. Like, our campaign was very much like Road Heels, Vagabonds. We had like an expert martial artist. We had a sort of a sleazy con artist kind of a guy. And then we had a dude with a magic hand. And it kind of was really cool to see us travel and encounter all these people. But at no point did we have a fixed base or anything like that at all.
You can kind of see one of them as an exploration game focused, and then that gets turned into more of a settlement development game, or it adds crafting elements and a few other things. It has a few other, well, I'll get into the types later because that's pretty core to like the actual system. So let's get into system then.
Yeah, let's do it.
So it uses what is referred to as the Cypher system. This is being the premier game of that system, though there is a generic version if you want to use it. And that's a really flexible system. And it still retains a lot of flavor. I know it tends to get billed in its own marketing as being like, oh, you don't have any time, but you want to play something. And, you can play anything you want using this system. I'm someone who rejects that concept because I believe that the mechanics of a game still impart some aspect of role play. Unless it's super rules light, like Fate, where it leans more on the creative input of different players at the table, but then it becomes more of an improv game. I wouldn't call this a rules light game. It's got very simple concepts, and it has a very sort of pointed rolling system. Once you get the basic idea about how to do a check in the game, everything else kind of falls into place. One standout feature of it is that it is a single die system. It only uses a D20. And it has a lot of other mechanics that kind of float in around that. But to me, that's kind of appealing. That's more of my preference. I don't like I've said before, I don't like using a whole bunch of dice. I don't want to have to like sift through things. That's fun. I'm not saying that's not a fun thing, but I prefer to forget that dice exist. And when I roll them, it's just I grab that and I roll it. Difficulties are set between 1 and 10. And then on the die, these are multiplied by 3. So any step, when you adjust something by a step, so say you have a skill that improves something by 1, it actually technically on the facing of the dice improves it by 3, which is pretty good. So that means if you're talking about a D20, any advancement is going to give you about 15% of a bonus. Also, any penalty will work the same way. Troy, tell us about the how would I say, the orientation of the game itself, because that is a really unique aspect. Well, it's not really unique, but this game really goes into that.
It does. When I GM Cypher, it was kind of an adjustment, but as the game master, you're not rolling dice. The player is rolling all the dice. It is completely player facing and player oriented. And I will explain that you'll set the difficulty value, right? So you'll set it between 1 and 10, multiply by 3 for the target value on the dice, the DC. And then the player will roll their 20. That's how you'll resolve basically everything. It's going to cover combat. It's going to cover skill checks in a conversation, in a foot race. It'll be how you pilot a vehicle. It basically handles the majority of your game interactions with this core dice, this core skill check. It flattens the game a little bit in some aspects, but because of how you interact with the core stats, there's a lot of this like playing and wagering that you do with your dice rolls. You know what I'm trying to say?
Player facing is interesting when it's done as mechanics, because it means that a lot of NPCs are going to be built around, it's going to be built more one-sided rather than in parity.
Yeah.
So the advantage of this is that as the GM, I just say, oh, this guy steps up and attacks. And then if it attacks you, you roll defense against whatever its value is.
Mm-hmm.
And when you attack it, that same value, maybe with a bonus, depending on if it's stronger in one area or another, will reflect onto that roll. The tricky part with this is that if there's ever a PvP situation, there are rules that cover that, but then it suddenly feels a lot less streamlined because the game wasn't really built for parity conflict. So two things using the same mechanics.
That's right.
And that's also, I guess, sort of true of PvP among NPCs. Usually the suggestion they give is narratively just, if this guy attacks that guy, then just narratively resolve the outcome. Maybe look at their stats to see which one of them is powerful, and that would give you but it's more fiat.
Yes, it 100% is.
It's not necessarily a problem, but it definitely adds a kind of tone. But if you're running it, the one major advantage is that the pressure is way off you to figure out when you're supposed to roll. You basically, if there's a moment of conflict you're created by putting a character in front of another player, then it's on them to react. And it should be pretty intuitive when you're supposed to roll.
And the primary advantage of this, I find, is that there's no going off the rails and losing your prep, so to speak, because everything can be defined through improvisation because the core components are so simple. Like if your party wants to change the adventure on a whim, you won't find yourself thinking, well, I haven't planned any of these encounters, because you can quickly repurpose any stat line you need into a new encounter. Basically, it's a difficulty value and whatever special modifiers you want to add. And then you're looking at damage and health, and that's it. So it's not that complicated to work with this system and really get into it. And I found when I was jamming the adjacent game Cypher, letting it be more improvisational really worked with this system. And that's not for every game or every table, but it definitely clicked with this game. And to kind of talk more about sort of these simple parts you get to work with, you get 3 core stats. They are going to be might, speed, and intellect. So they don't exactly map to the classic 6, but they definitely give you the same handholds for your character. And these core stats, importantly, also are the meta currency. They are spendable. So when you're using these core stats, you can burn or spend off them like health, which they are effectively as well. That this is how your HP works too. But you can choose to spend your meta currency stats that also serves as your health to achieve great feats. And that's where this game gets really interesting, is managing this stack. We used poker chips at our table, and it was so easy to visualize your 3 stacks, your green, your red, your blue, and you would just move your tokens off as you spent or took damage. And it was really elegant in many ways. You don't need to use poker chips. There's a ton of different solutions, but the way in which your character is is made quite tangible out of these pieces, and you can track them in a very physical way, I found really fun.
Yeah, I want to add to that, actually. It was really fun just handling chips, and you can feel the stats in your hand. It's very tactile, and you feel more connected to the game session,
100%.
Yeah, and you can see they're kind of like levels. Like you can even just eyeball it and see when you're getting low. There's a few things that augment the use of those. So one of the ones they have there is called Edge, which is essentially kind of like, it's sort of like having points that you don't have to pay into. So say an ability, to activate a certain ability, it requires you to spend 4 intellect points, and you have an edge of 2 intellect. It's kind of like a discount.
Oh, that's right.
So now you only have to pay 2. And that goes up as your character advances, though it's pretty gradual. But it means that the baseline for certain things gets easier. And eventually, if say it only takes 1 thing to activate and you have an edge of 1, that now becomes a free ability that is only limited by action economy.
The action economy is weird in this game in that it's very limited in what you can do every turn.
It's limited, and it's also vague enough that you could just sort of ignore that aspect. But the idea is that each character only does 1 thing per turn.
Yes.
I've seen people state that it might also include a bit of movement. So I can move up to a person and do a thing. But we had a scenario where there was flintlock firearms being used, and it was reload and then shoot. And if you wanted to move position, that was a different action. I think if I were running that now, I'd probably just allow for half as much movement combined with whatever that other action was.
Oh, that's smart.
It's written in such a way where you kind of have to call the thing because an action is fairly significant. So if I like run across a room, that's an action because the intention I'm making is to get from point A to point B, as that's the primary thing I'm doing. If I was shooting, I might let somebody shoot and move into a room a little bit, maybe half or 1/3 the distance that they might normally. But it doesn't straight up say that.
It's true.
I may have missed it in the revised version. They may have changed that. I was looking for that rule, but I had other things that I needed to do.
It is also a range band game as well. That's another thing to specify, where things are not tracked in feet, meters, grid squares. It is off of your 3 range bands that's proximal to your character. And that creates less of a tactical environment, but a really satisfying narrative environment for what I think this game encourages is a certain swashbuckly heroic play.
So range bands are an interesting topic of games because I know that some games use them. Some implement them a little bit better than others. The thing that I think range bands are good for is if you are playing theater of the mind style play, where you're not using any kind of representative stuff. And so to describe the exact distance of something is cumbersome because now people have to imagine, oh, that guy is 60 feet away from me. What does 60 feet look like again? You know, it's not always within a certain distance. I think people can kind of intuit that, but being that specific is more of an affect of older role-playing games and war games.
Yes.
The one thing I like about the range bands when they are implemented well is that the way that I think of the basic range bands that are used in Numenera, the ones I tend to like, though I think you can have other ones, are close, near, and far.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's exactly how they're called. They might. But so close is I'm close enough to reach out and touch that person, or with like 1 to 2 steps be right up against them. So like a sword's length away from someone. And then near is close enough for me to move toward them, but still far enough away that I couldn't just hit them from where I was standing.
Right.
So it's some range weapons would work well in that. And then far is anything farther than that. Pretty much that's where your long range, really long range attacks. That's where you crack out the sniper rifle.
Yeah, exactly.
A question I have for you guys is, do you think Monte Cook is really, just since you're mentioning theater of the mind, is there any mention of miniatures in the book itself or the use of?
There's mention that they exist and that you can use them. They certainly talks about being able to use components for tracking stat pools and stuff like that.
Yep.
There is some mention of that, but there's not what I would call emphasis so much as, for representation of to orientate, but there aren't it's not laying out grids or anything like that, or even suggesting that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So it is more of a narrative focused game. And because of the complexity level that the rules sit at, that makes a lot of sense. So there's 2 other components about the characters. So that there's something called effort. So effort is not attached to any particular stat pool the way edge would be, but is the maximum amount of points you can spend to improve the outcome of a roll.
Yes.
And that is sort of a linear improvement over time. And all of these things are improved by experience. And while might, speed, and intellect are sort of like metacurrencies, not exactly, because they are character tied. They don't change the story per se.
Yeah.
Experience is absolutely used as a metacurrency in this game. What you would consider inspiration or luck points in other systems is experience points. But they are also used to improve your character. There's also some other really neat ideas depending on how much you spend in a situation. So the short version is 1 point allows you to re-roll or augment a roll that you've already made. Augment a roll you haven't made or re-roll one that you have already made. Another use of it is, I believe, 2 points essentially allows, it's kind of like a gimme for something happening. So the the way that I sort of understand it to be is, say there's a bunch of goons between you and the goal, like maybe it's a magic chalice or whatever. You can spend 2 points of XP to just say you get past them because you want to dramatically intervene to get to that goal because your strategy depends on that. It might depend on what character you're playing,
Right.
but the idea is that you can kind of almost have narrative control for just a very narrow area and kind of just say, yeah, I run between them before they even know what's happening. I believe 3 points allows you to kind of like alter something in a more permanent way, but I think that it's more of a negotiation with the GM.
Yeah.
And then as normal, it can be spent to improve character. But it's interesting having that all tied together like that. Like, Troy, what was your experience in using experience as kind of like a get out of jail free kind of meta currency?
That's what's so interesting about it, because it is a get out of jail card, right? But it's not free, because you want to advance your character. You want to increase your ability to spend your health, right? Or your statistics, your might, speed, intellect. So with this game, you're pressured to not spend the XP, but then if you need to, for example, get to the elevator and there's like a bunch of burly guards in the way, and this is more of a Cypher example than a Numenera example, perhaps, but you would spend 2 and then you would perform some feats of acrobatics as you maneuver through these guys. And that is really satisfying as a character. And I've seen a lot of RPGs lock that into high-level character builds. Like, oh, you want to waste all the NPC low-level bad guys? You can totally do that once you're a level 10 and you just spend your once per day ability, right? It's kind of cool that they've moved it to this currency that anyone can use, but you don't want to use it for this. You got to save it to enhance your character. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck relying on these XP points all the time to get you out of the jams you're in.
Yeah. And it's interesting having the choice about when you're going to spend it and will you use it for something else.
I love it. I think it's clever.
Yeah. Again, it creates a tight economy, and I think that's one of the things that I really like about this system is the tightness of the economy and the way that everything is spendable and adjustable.
Yeah.
So another unique thing, and this was the thing that sold me on the system, because I had been kind of looking for something that did this, and then this game came along and it does this, which is how you define a character. Like in Dungeons and Dragons, you will have your race or species, your class, and then you probably have some equipment. You might have some other things brought in, like other background elements that might add skills. Some games do that more. Dungeons and Dragons is obviously pretty straightforward. Oh, I guess in 5th edition, they've got...
you got your background package, right?
Right, background packages, yeah. So this game does it a little bit different, and I love the ethos that it uses. So characters are broken up into 3 parts. They're called a type, which is pretty close to class, descriptor, which is sort of like a background, but it can be other things, and focus, which is like a unique flourish.
Yeah.
Almost like a superpower in some cases, but it doesn't have to be supernatural necessarily. And it is broken down, the way that it's explained is character name is a adjective, noun, who verbs. And the adjective is the descriptor, the noun is the type, and the verbs, the verb being the focus. And it makes you think about the character in a completely different way than simply saying, this slot has been filled and this slot has been filled. The fact that it's a phrase that can be described. I'm trying to think of a good example of a character from one of these. So you might say that Bob is a lucky thief who works the back alleys. And that last one is a legitimate one. That's actually something.
That's a good one, too.
But that's an example of one that's not supernatural. But there's things like is able to manipulate magnetism or something to that equivalent. I think there's one that's like rides the lightning, and you literally have like lightning powers. You can like shoot bolts of lightning out of your hand. It's really where the superhero-y element kind of comes into play. It fits the setting of Numenera really well because that world is so imbued with technology that the idea of people having some of these unique powers, certainly the player characters, it's debatable whether other ordinary people have these. Probably the world would not make that much sense if everyone had them. But the idea that certain significant people have these really unique abilities is a really big selling point for playing the game and making a character. Because I think some of my complaints of other systems, unless they're really tailored to that style, to a particular style of play, which I guess I'd call down and dirty style.
Yeah.
The cool thing about Numenera is it's one of those games where your character's interesting right out of the gate.
Yes. There's not really an equivalent level 1 in Numenera.
Not or like a level 0, the way that some games might do it. Like Dungeon Crawl Classics obviously has more of that down and dirty style. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay leans more into that sort of you're nobody and then you got to make yourself into somebody.
Yeah.
And in fact, this is one of the things I've always said to people I know when I'm explaining why the Cypher system is good, is that it's actually the best system I've found for playing superheroes.
I agree.
It has all of those superhero-y elements, and they're flexible enough that you can make pretty much any kind of hero. I think they're generally heroes that are more in the Marvel archetype than, say, the DC archetype, but that's just a matter of power level and style. But yeah, that's a big selling point of the game, is that you're cool right away.
I remember the game we were playing, and I kind of jumped on your campaign a little to the tail end of it. I remember making like essentially spellcaster, but I got to focus in sword play, so then I got to make my spellblade type of character. I thought it was really fun. That way you can kind of customize it with a lot of flavoring.
Yeah, absolutely. So the character types, which are the more core element of the character, there are 6 in total, but 3 in the core book, and then another 3 in Destiny, which is the expansion.
Yeah.
So all of these are, the core ones are Glaive, which is your warrior type, Nano, which is your caster mage type, Jack, which is sort of like a specialist, but kind of like a thief. It's your rogue, basically. And then Destiny adds the Arcus, which is, I guess you can call like a leader or a tactician character, but also, that could cover your bards and more of your diplomatic characters. And then you have your rights, and that's right spelt with a W. And they're kind of like your crafter, your artificer, alchemist.
Mechanic, right?
Mechanic, yeah. It goes along with a lot of the crafting elements. And then the last one is the Delver, which is kind of like the Jack, but more focused around finding unique items and treasure. So they're more like an Indiana Jones character than, say, a Fafhrd and Grey Mouser type character. They're less of the...
Dare I say a ranger?
Yeah, kind of. But in a more technologically oriented world.
Yes, okay.
Sort of like I like to think of them more like treasure hunters.
Or scavengers.
Yeah, whereas the Jack is more of a specialist that might lean into a more skill-oriented build. Skills are really odd in this game, but the Jack is more in that area, whereas the Delver has a lot of like improvised uses of materials.
That's cool. And this is a point I wanted to bring up here just quickly.
Mm-hmm.
With these 3 other classes, or other types, we'll call them, the Arcus, the Wright, and the Delver, they really flesh out what you can do with these character creation options,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where, again, it's like Destiny's pretty core to this experience now. It does change the game from maybe what we remember from Ninth World at the start, but I really don't see a campaign without having all 6 of these character builds now.
Yeah, they definitely cover all the bases, and you don't feel as though you're lacking some kind of choice. It's important to remember that the Destiny types that are added in are more oriented mechanically around what they call communities.
Yes.
Or the crafting system that exists in that book. But they do have additional abilities for the classic Glaive Nano Jack in that book. So when you go through different tiers of your characters, when you're spending your experience points, you have a list of abilities that you can purchase per every character is broken up into 6 tiers, but that's not to think of it as levels because you're advancing between those. Like there's several advancements. It's more like when you start the game, you have a menu that's made up of 6 items. And then after you've purchased a certain number of character advancements, you go up a tier and now that menu is expanded by double. And then that goes all the way up to 6 times. And Destiny brings a lot of those community mechanics to the original classes as well.
With skills, this is something that kind of is strange. Not strange bad, but there are only 3 tiers of skill. There is effectively not trained, right?
Untrained, yeah. Which is not having a skill, basically.
Yeah, right. Which is just, a blank space on your character sheet. And then there would be trained followed by mastered. So in effect, it's maybe a better way to put it that there's only 2 tiers because it's either not there at all or trained or mastered. And that's not a lot of granularity in terms of your abilities to do things. So, Max, what did you do about this in our campaign?
I added an intermediary level, or not exactly. So a skill, if it's trained, it's moved up by 1. It's 1 shift, which is 3 points on the dice. So as I said, every +1 in this game is more like a 15% jump, which is pretty significant. But I added an intermediary where I had trained, expert, and then master. And it was basically skills go up to 3. I did that more for our supers game. I suggested that to you, and then you adopted that.
Yeah.
From my experience. I remember kind of adding it into the Numenera campaign that I ran at the end, because I was like, oh.
I do remember that.
Yeah, it feels like, I don't think it's necessary, because if you think about mastered in the rules as written, that's a 30% bonus.
That's significant.
But there is room enough to bring that up to a 45.
I feel like the difference is between trained and mastered. I want something else. I want like experienced. That's where I feel like there's a little bit of a gap, because you go from like, I'm in the door to I'm on top of the mountain. You're already like the guru. There's no step in between that I feel like would make sense. And it kind of, again, echoes my earlier comment about the action economy, which feels too tight in this game as well. So like there are some things that they've flattened almost too much in this design.
Yeah.
But I mean, when you get to have like just a sentence you can say at the table that encapsulates your character, both thematically and mechanically, that's super cool.
Yeah. And the fact that values move in pretty big chunks. And this isn't including situational modifiers. So, maybe you have the high ground and then you already get a +1 from that.
And they're big levers, like you say, right? A +1 is secretly a +3.
Yeah.
So that's like you're playing with big blocks, which is fun. It's not like a Chaosium game where you're making like, oh, I've gone up 3% in this skill. You know what I mean? It's like, no.
What does that even mean?
This is like exactly, right? Like this is a meaningful chunk. And I think when you're playing this game, it's heroic. It's not heroic necessarily in one coloration of that theme, but it is for sure giving you like boldness, big moves, easy to handle decisions as the GM, allowing your characters to be in dramatic situations.
Yeah.
And the Numenera setting does a heck of a job of giving you those situations. And to move on into like more of what the setting has to offer, there's this core concept in the game. We've alluded to this because we've said this word a bunch of times already, but there are ciphers. And this is where the cipher system gets its name. And this is a core part of Numenera's experience, where you have these one-use items that are in many respects a scroll. You could think of them like that. Like they're a spell that you can burn off, and then you move on. But they can do so much. They could be more like a potion. They could be more like a super weapon. It could be a teleportation gate. They can do practically anything you imagine. However, they only do it once.
Yeah, it's a fire and it's gone kind of thing. And what they do for the game is add something that could be of an extremely high power level for whatever you're doing. But because it has that limited one use and might have some chaotic consequences,
Yep.
it's almost more narrative in some ways, even though they do have directly statistical. Like, I think one of them is like a gravity well bomb, where it basically creates a black hole that just starts pulling everything into it. So that's a good example. In Cypher, there's some interesting things that work in other campaigns. Cyphers are they feel thematically appropriate to Numenera more specifically.
Yeah.
But I remember in the Supers campaign that you ran, Troy, Jay's character he was basically Iron Man, or War Machine, maybe is a better example. And he had missile pods. And those missile pods were tracked as ciphers because they would shoot a barrage of an attack and then they would fall off. And it made tracking that and having a system for it a lot easier than, say, being have to count ammo for it. And if you're thinking of like a swarm missile pod, that makes sense because, like, how many missiles is it actually going to hold if it's tiny?
Well, and it really suits like the scope of what a combat encounter is built around, because you're not doing 6-second rounds, right?
Yeah.
So when you use your cipher to fire your rocket pods, that's like a minute or two of combat that you're sort of representing. So it's like, as he's leaping from, like, you know, doing these power armored leaps, firing missiles at the aliens in a dramatic confrontation, right?
Yeah.
Like that would be a couple moments of time, and the representation of burning that cipher is like using all the ammo, as opposed to the other thing they have, pardon me, what's the term? Artifact. Thank you. An artifact is kind of like a magic item in a more of a traditional sense, but it's a reusable tool, much like a cipher, but it is not consumed upon its use. You get to keep it.
Yeah. Destiny adds more rules for building ciphers, though the outcome can be a bit strange, but also repairing or recharging artifacts. The original game has it. It's basically a cipher that isn't quite as dramatic, but has charges in it that can be used multiple times. So this is like your fireball staff or something equivalent to that.
So then actually, Max, so for Troy's game we were playing, my character had the missile pods as the cipher, but then the mech suit was the artifact, I think, right?
It was a piece of equipment, which is a little bit different, but I think you had a gun that was basically ran on the artifacts system. Okay.
Right.
So
because you had your plasma gun or something.
Yeah, I think it was a plasma gun. Yeah, you had some kind of cannon, and that had like a total charge rate. And kind of the way that we ran that Supers game, Destiny has that idea that like you can recharge and refill those things. It's sort of suggested in the original book, but that game has more of a bunch of people running around finding things and using them. And so the idea of recharging those things is less of a focus.
But, you know, it kind of makes me think the way we ran our Supers game was sort of like X-Men meets XCOM.
Yep.
And doesn't Destiny give you that option? It was kind of funny. We kind of like anticipated that with our own house ruling earlier, because I guess that is something that I bet a lot of tables did, is they created something more permanent for their players to jump off of. And here we go. Look at this new revised edition of Numenera we're talking about right now.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. That campaign ended with, I think, Jay's character somehow getting us a like flying aircraft carrier shield, like, you know, Marvel's Shield style like battle carrier.
Yep. 100%.
And that could have turned into base building mechanics, like if we had kept playing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the equipment is really easy to handle in this game in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
Beyond ciphers and artifacts, you have weapons and armor. Weapons are classed with light, medium, or heavy with a fixed damage. So there's no damage die. There's no rolling a D8 or a D12 or something. It's just those core fixed values based on what class of weapon it is. And your armor, conversely, will act as DR, damage reduction, with 5 different sizes or scales available. And some of them can stack. So you can kind of layer a little bit in sort of a creative, fun way. And it allows you to soak your damage as opposed to increasing an AC or something to that effect.
Yeah. An important note about how damage is dealt from weapons is that, yes, it is a fixed value, but it can be modified with uses of effort. So you can spend extra points that you would normally use for the attack roll, and instead of applying them to improving the outcome of the roll, you can actually apply effort to increasing the damage of the weapon.
You can sweat to punch harder, and I love that.
Effort in that sense, like you're limited by how much effort you can apply to things, and that improves with your character. It can only be applied. So if you have 2 points of effort, you can increase accuracy and damage. But if you only have one, you got to pick between the two. Kind of tying back more into the setting, the money system in this game is, it works like any other currency system in mechanical terms, but the way it's described in the actual setting is really quirky. I liked it, but I thought it made more sense only in this setting. So they're called shins, which is, I guess, their word for dollars. But what they're made up of is random gewgaws and baubles.
Debris, effectively.
People's currency is almost like exchanging like colored shells in the way that like ancient currencies might have worked. But in this case, the whatever you're trading, like cowrie shells or something like that, are actually like the screw bolt off of some weird thing that's made out of like an iridescent metal. You don't have to describe them, but they are kind of, they might be fun to, if you wanted to describe them. It's like, oh yeah, I pull out this like marble, and when you hold it up to the light, there's like 2 seconds of a little movie that plays. Like, they're not really that might be more like an oddity, which is another type of object, but it falls into that idea that you're trading cool junk for stuff.
Yeah, 100%. And it also sort of plays into the idea that nobody carries a ton of money on them because you don't have a debit card, you don't have dollar bills, you have weirdly shaped trinket garbage, and you have to carry that. And I always thought it would be part and parcel of the setting to sort of make that something that eats your inventory space, to make a Diablo reference, perhaps. And I don't know. I like the shins as a concept. Again, having this like all the core parts of this game be such a tight loop back to the setting and to the mechanics just makes it really satisfying. And in the revised edition, they did introduce a new currency, we'll call it, iotum. And that is a crafting component that you can use.
So those are more like functional pieces of random technology. And it's described as kind of just being larger pieces of random junk, but that have some kind of reactive or mechanical or interchangeable function. Like, you can recognize it as having a property, and then there are rules that you use it as a currency for building stuff. I guess you could sell it as well. What was really weird was, before this, I had always sort of had the idea that shins could be used maybe as like an item you could use to quickly jerry-rig or repair something. Like, not in a permanent way, but in a way that's like, oh, I need another charge from this artifact. Maybe I've got like something that works as a tiny battery that I might have been using as money. To be fair, I think this defines those things as being different by having a different type of material. And I now think of shins as being more like something about the size of a D20 and purely decorative. One idea I always thought is like, oh, you kill the goblins and you see if they have any gold on them. In this case, it's like you kill the robot and then you chip off like ornate parts of it and use that as money. And that's how you
take out the GPU, man.
Yeah, that's how you get loot, like money loot from creatures. Or you like remove like its eye, and somehow that's stable enough that you could trade it and use it as currency. And then the last type that they have in there are very just world flavor based. They could be used as quest items or clues, but they're called oddities. And they're essentially pieces of technology very akin to the world that nobody knows what they do. They don't do anything super useful, but they're interesting.
Yeah. They could be something important to a character's background or motivation. They could also be a key that you need to unlock something that isn't powerful in its own right, for example, right? To like get through a door of some variety. So there's a lot an oddity can represent or do for a game master in the setting, but they don't really empower your character in any meaningful way. Like if you have an oddity, it's not going to save your life.
Yeah. One example in science fiction of an oddity, or at least an idea of an oddity, I'm trying to remember the author of the story. It's a very obscure series of short stories that are based around this material called slow glass. And it's basically a unique type of glass that takes centuries for the light to penetrate all the way through it. So when you find these pieces of glass and you pick them up, you can see it's like looking at a piece of history happening in front of you, but you can only see it once. So like they're impregnated with these photographic images of people that were in front of the mirror, or not mirror, they were in front of the piece of glass. And so you find like a fragment of this and it's like, someone standing in front of their new car and you're like, I don't even know. And you living in like a billion years of the future, like, I don't even know what that is. I think that's a person.
Yeah, exactly. I recognize one of these things.
And it doesn't have any like useful function, but it's neat. It makes the world feel more real. There are tables in the book. You just randomly throw these things in. Yeah, so we covered Iotum, which is sort of mechanical things that you can use to make stuff or repair things. The Destiny book has salvaging rules, which are way more in depth than, I guess, more of the idea that is implied in the first book.
Mm-hmm.
It requires exploration. You have to do skill checks to try and retrieve Iotum from, say, something that you found, like some mechanical device. So you can kind of scrap things, which is neat. And there's crafting, mainly in the idea of having plans. So these are like blueprints. And in the way that the game and the world support the idea that something could be technological or kind of magical, or it could be mundane, it's similar in this, in the idea of the blueprint. So the blueprint could sort of be in your head, but the idea is that they're so complex, they have to exist in some form that can be endangered. So it's probably more like something you've written out, like a book, or it's on some kind of crystal or chip. And it does require skill checks to actually develop things, and there's a certain amount of time investment required. So yeah, I haven't used the crafting system but it seemed robust, and it was very much along the lines of the system we were improvising for that game that Troy was running.
Yeah, for the Supers game where we just beat up aliens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you craft items, you can also make ciphers, the one-use powerful effect tools we've talked about. There are also artifacts. We've discussed those. But importantly, there are now installations. So these are like static constructions. They will benefit communities, not just player characters on their own. And they could be thought of as things like turrets to defend a location, a power generator to power a community, or a water purifier, or really all types of things that you could imagine. To make a video game reference, if you want to think about the village construction or the town crafting of Fallout 4,
yeah,
you're not wrong. You could see that influence in this game. And these installations really give you a sense of like permanence to the world that Destiny talks about, like that building a better future. It's all in the installation construction and the following step, the collaborative crafting, where some of these installations or artifacts or even ciphers may require teamwork, where you're going to have to combine skills from multiple characters and resources.
Mm-hmm.
And this is nice because it's a group goal, right? It's something for the campaign to center on for a moment as everyone tries to achieve like building something greater for their little settlement. I think that's really cool and makes the crafting process more than just like downtime dice rolls.
Yep.
When you kind of have to work together and quest it out to achieve the building of something significant or substantial for your settlement.
Troy, I think I remember actually my character made light armor, but then made it so you didn't need any training. So like the whole party could use it without needing training for light armor. So you just got free armor class.
Yeah, you made like ultra light armor. Yeah.
Yeah, because you were doing Tony Stark stuff.
the idea of installations and the community mechanics are an interesting addition. The way communities are treated is almost like a character with stats. And there are some abilities that are associated with your type that actually improve the community when you're part of it. So I think one example they have for the glaive is that it basically, if you take that ability, the martial prowess of everyone in the community improves, so they're better at defending themselves, which is a neat idea. It's kind of like, I guess the implication is that if you're the warrior, you're also like training other people to act as guards.
I totally get that. It's really cool. I think more contemporary games that have come out after this have definitely tried to borrow from these mechanics themselves. Not that Numenera is the origin point for this by any means, but I think it's a comfortable and confident execution of these mechanics that you can see something like Bastions from 5 point something looking back towards. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it is very sort of chunky in its mechanics, but it goes along with the way the players work. So, and it's not as rules light or simplistic as some other systems, nor is it that in sort of interpretive style of mechanics that like a really light system would use.
Yeah.
So the setting, and we'll briefly go through this because we're hopefully not rambling on too long. We've kind of touched on this a bit. So Numenera is Earth a billion years in the future after the rise and fall of 8 other major ages. And like the time of an age is not strictly defined, but it's a really long time. And some of these civilizations have been everything from interstellar to like pan-galactic, and some of them may have just fallen into ruin. In fact, the game even has, as a form of descriptor, I forgot what they're called, but they're basically aliens that have been living on Earth so long, they're basically now, like, they don't know any other world. So, Earth was part of some huge galactic federation, and aliens emigrated to Earth, and then that fell apart, and they've been there for so long, and they think of themselves as different from humans, and certainly rarer, but they're also just other people that are there, and they have different properties, and they're usually quite unique. One of the supplements actually adds the idea of artificial beings, so essentially you can play an android, and it fills the descriptor slot in order to make that happen, make sense. Yeah, so if you're ever wondering how, like if you were to use Cipher System, like how would I play an elf or a dwarf, it would fill the descriptor spot and have some appropriately themed abilities. So anyway, we're trying to get away from the mechanics. What am I doing? So yeah, the key themes are discovery is a huge theme in the game, and the idea that things are mysterious and you don't fully understand what the world is. One aspect of the world that explains how magic works is that one of those previous civilizations proliferated nanites, basically microscopic or even like quantum level machines, into everything. So what the nano, now you sort of get where that name comes from if you hadn't guessed already, is someone who, by either intuition or knowledge, is able to get those tiny quantum machines to do what they want, and then it allows them to like shoot fireballs out of their hands.
It's this approach to magic that's both grounded in like a certain realism in a way, where magic isn't ethereal, it's real in this world because of the technology that defines it, but it has become so alien and remote to anything we could relate to that it is just flat out bonkers magic.
Now, to counteract that idea of this sort of crazy level of technology, I guess what you could call the default of, I don't want to call it technology level because it's not really that, because obviously that, but there's an idea that this is sort of like a primitive age, and it very much models itself on a sort of medieval technology level. So things are very agrarian. And what is understood about technology is not super clearly understood. So there's an order of priests that actually understand technology as a scientific fact, but because ordinary people don't understand it as such, they have to explain it using rituals. You can kind of think of it sort of like in Warhammer 40K's Adeptus Mechanicus, but they actually know how it works and they're just dressing it up.
That's really funny. I love that.
Though there's some debate as to how ethical that is and actually how much they know. So it's not clear cut even in that sense.
And there is also, speaking of the technology, the data sphere. And that's the remnant of the ancient digital networks.
Yes.
So a lot more than the internet, but kind of like the internet, but much more pervasive and three-dimensional, so to speak. And characters can still interact with it. They can retrieve knowledge from it, find information, including maps, blueprints, all types of things. But it does also include digital entities, which can be sentient and completely alien in their logic. Like, again, it's sort of like taking these supernatural concepts and rooting them in a sci-fi, like, oh, there are totally ghosts. It just happens to be an AI from the data sphere, but it's a ghost in all other terms.
Actually, it fixes the netrunner problem from, say, a cyberpunk game, because the problem with that is like, oh, I'm the netrunner, so I get to play a weird solo game at the same time everyone else does because I'm the only one that has the skill or equipment to go into cyberspace.
Yeah.
But in this case, because technology is in everything, if you wanted to transport your party to a virtual world, it would work on everybody.
Oh, easily.
Everybody's in that data sphere.
And there is something else that's, I think it's a good element of the setting, but for the GM, it's like used with caution, but it's called the Iron Wind. And this is like a crazy effect. It's a storm of nanotechnology. Think of it like sort of like, the desert, like dust storms mixed with a tornado.
Yeah.
And it's passing through the landscape and it transforms anything that it touches. Flesh, stone, metal, and it reshapes it into these grotesque forms. It completely can throw the best laid plans to absolute utter chaos. It's a source of terror, obviously, but it's also really cool and very fascinating things can be created. And it can really mess up a party. But we had one part of our adventure where we ended up going to this huge, like, tented camp where we hid out from the Iron Wind, and the drama within the camp and the tournament we participated in there was as good as anything that could have happened outside of it. So it was really cool that we had like a bottle episode kind of because of what the Iron Wind was able to do narratively. So it's awesome. It's just like, if you're always running from it, maybe that's tiring, but I really think it's just another part of the setting that adds a lot of, well, chaos.
Yeah, it's basically a big storm of angry nanites. So use sparingly, but it can be effective for like holding players in one location if needed.
Yeah.
The term I was thinking, Aeon priests. So that's
yes.
And then they're part of the Order of Truth. And there's in fact an evil version of them that's very similar to the Sith from Star Wars, at least thematically, in the way that they believe in individual power supremacy rather than like communal technological control.
Mm-hmm.
And also like the Sith, there's no more than 2 at a time. I mean, there might be more spread out, but there's no communities of these people.
Yeah, that's right.
They usually act as like scholars or people that you can talk to because they know things. But there's this sort of, I love the idea that there's this caginess, that they don't want to give away all of the secrets because they're worried about what will happen if people really know how it works. Which, could be condescending, but it adds drama. Yeah, so that's our sort of nutshell version of Numenera.
There's a lot to cover.
I know. I really like the system itself. The setting, I find that one criticism I have about the revised version is that it's almost a bit pedantic about trying to explain certain aspects that I thought were a little bit more straightforward in the first edition, but the difference between the language is so subtle and most of it's exactly the same that it doesn't ruin really anything.
I agree. And like Numenera is a setting that gives you a lot of potential.
Yes.
A lot of avenues for player created nonsense. Like it doesn't feel absurd like in some more traditional settings that are based closer to a world we can relate to. In this game, you can, if you have the right cipher, you can unlock anything from the get-go. So that level of player agency from the word go is so cool. The amount of stuff you can do, the craziness of the world around you. But I will also say that it is also very alien as a setting. So some players may have a harder time grasping what it is they can do and are expected to do within this setting.
Yeah, I definitely recommend it. And it is easy to run, just like the ads say. So aside from that, trying to get into the world, it's the buy-in isn't too steep once you get past the initial understanding of it. That'll be it for this one. Next week's topic is about meta currencies. So we kind of touched on that with the experience points in this game, but this is essentially covering everything that the players can get that they can use to change the story of the game. They get a little fragment of that GM power, and we'll talk about the fun and some of the pitfalls that go along with that. So until then, enjoy your time in your games, and happy gaming.
Happy gaming, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.